Okay, this lecture is about MSG and MfG, manufactured free glutamate, how to recognize them and how to avoid them. I'll briefly talk a little bit about hippocampal excitotoxicity, but the main purpose of this lecture is simply to provide a list of potential sources of MSG or free manufactured glutamate, so one will be more aware of that when reading nutrient labels and how to avoid it. I can also tell you, though, what it comes down to is most processed foods contain either MSG or some form of manufactured free glutamate, and therefore you might want to be very careful about eating them or even try to avoid them altogether. Okay, so glutamate is the deprotonated version of glutamic acid. So it's a amino acid, therefore it has a carboxylic acid on it. When it's unprotonated, it's called glutamate. When it has the proton, the hydrogen on there, it's called glutamic acid. Glutamate is the most common neurotransmitter in the brain. Different estimates say it's about 80% of brain neurotransmitters. So MSG is for Mono Sodium Glutamate, which is the sodium salt of the deprotonated glutamate. Okay, MFG is manufactured free glutamate. And so when free glutamate is present in excessive amounts, it increases the likelihood that it'll be rapidly absorbed, and it can potentially have a negative effect upon the brain. That's the main concern with it. Normally, when you eat a protein, yes, there's going to be glutamic acid residues in the protein, but the digestive system kind of gradually slows down the process, and the gut is able to control it. And we could talk about that more some other time. I don't want to go into all the physiology of glutamic acid today, but in addition, aspartame is made in part from aspartate as well as phenylalanine and methanol, and aspartate itself is also an excitatory neurotransmitter. So excitatory means it stimulates the post-synaptic neuron, causing it to fire more action potentials. When you stimulate the post-synaptic neuron, that's a normal thing, for example, in the hippocampus, the memory center of the brain, to release glutamate as a neurotransmitter, diffuses across the synaptic cleft, activates the postsynaptic neuron, and then the postsynaptic neuron fires an action potential. Its process of activation includes the entry of calcium into the postsynaptic neuron, in particular through what is called the NMDA channel, a calcium channel that lets calcium come into the postsynaptic neuron. Calcium is like a light switch, and when the calcium concentration in the cytoplasm gets high, it causes the cell to fire an action potential. The cell wants to very tightly regulate its calcium concentration in the cytoplasm, and it does this through something called a NACA exchanger. NACA is NACA for sodium calcium exchanger, to pump it out through the plasma membrane out into the extracellular matrix. In addition, there's going to be something called the sarcoplasm endoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase to pump it into the endoplasmic reticulum, again to get that calcium out of the cytoplasm so it's not activating the cell to fire more action potentials than is necessary. Action potentials are the electrical discharge by which one neuron communicates with another. So in order to manage its calcium, the cell requires lots of energy, lots of ATP. If a person's fasting, they'll have a little bit less energy to do this, and then they're really in trouble if they're hypoglycemic at this time. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but what's the relevance of all this is that the brain's very tightly regulated to do what it's supposed to do in a healthy way. When you add an external unusual stimulant upon it, like excessive psychological stress, like monosodium glutamate, like excessive amounts of free glutamate, potentially you can cause pathological increased firing of that postsynaptic neuron, and it can fire so much that it burns out, becomes damaged. It can even die by apoptosis, programmed cell death, because it can't meet its energy needs of what's demanded of it. Some people aren't very sensitive to MSG. Some are. Some have headaches, insomnia. And then my big concern is, can it injure the hippocampus? And, a baby has a less developed blood-brain barrier, so they're more vulnerable to it. Also, elderly persons have a less developed blood-brain barrier due to blood-brain barrier injury from previous trauma or strokes, ischemic disease, hypoxia, hypotension, and related things. What protects your neuron? Having adequate blood glucose level, having adequate oxygen delivery to the tissues, having potassium there, K+, for it's a vasodilator, and it also is important for maintaining good plasma membrane ion pumps. It's the potassium that people tend to be deficient in. Magnesium is also important because it blocks the glutamate receptor, which is called the NMDA receptor. Magnesium binds right in the center of the inner channel, and blocks calcium from passing through, which is a good thing. Vitamin C antioxidants also help to protect the brain in the presence of excitotoxicity. Excitotoxicity is the phrase used for excessive excitatory stimulation by glutamate, by MSG, by free glutamic acid, etc. Okay, so some of the things that potentiate excitotoxicity of the hippocampal neurons. And this is really a key concept here, that it's not just one thing. People like to ask a question and make everything simple. What causes dementia? What causes injury to the hippocampus? And what it quite often is multiple things contributing to it. And I had a great learning experience when I was a wrestler in college. My coach was Dave Schultz, world and Olympic champion. And like I said, during the beginning when I first met him, he was kind of fat, he was kind of weak in the weight room, and he was kind of slow when we would run sprints up the hill and whatnot. But what made him so great was he had so much meticulous attention to detail at every last bit of technique. So it was like he could read his opponent's mind and know what they were going to do. So the reason I mention all that is be aware of the different things that can potentiate excitotoxicity. And once you know them, they're easy to avoid. And in so doing, you protect yourself from brain injury. You're less likely to become demented. So excessive stress. Stress causes increased glutamate release in the hippocampus. So it causes increased excitation of the post-synaptic neuron. And people can get themselves into an obsessive loop like post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, where they can't stop thinking about something. And everybody's had some personal experience where they were briefly obsessed with some issue of their life emotionally, for example. Other things mimic that response because they raise the same hormones. That would be sleep deprivation, drinking caffeine, for example. Those are stimulants that cause increased release of glutamate as a neurotransmitter in the hippocampus. Okay, hypoxia is a problem because you need a lot of energy to run those plasma membrane ion pumps, which are needed to get that calcium out of the plasma membrane. You got to pump that calcium out of the cytoplasm, out of the cytoplasm, put it into the extracellular matrix, put it into the endoplasmic reticulum, so it's not sitting in the cytoplasm where it's going to keep that neuron firing and firing when it shouldn't be. So hypoxia for any reason, smoking cigarettes, because of sleep apnea, because of dietary fat causing the red blood cells to stick together in a rouleau formation, because of vasoconstriction from excessive dietary sodium. Hypotension, low blood pressure, low blood supply to the brain causes a decrease in delivery of oxygen and glucose. The brain needs that oxygen and glucose to make energy to manage its calcium, cytoplasm calcium levels. So atrial fibrillation, you lose the atrial kick, the atrial contribution of filling to the left ventricle when the heart beats, and you can drop perfusion to the brain. CHF is congestive heart failure. Carotid stenosis means atherosclerosis of the artery that goes up to the brain, dropping the amount of blood supply to the brain. Overtreated hypertension, dropping the brain's blood pressure. And I call these mouse equivalents in relation to, in a previous lecture, I spoke about tying off of the carotid artery mouse experience with Jack Delatorre. And so that's a good lecture for that if you're curious as to how to prevent dementia on this YouTube channel as a video. Next thing is hypoglycemia. Not that uncommon that diabetics give themselves too much insulin and they drop their blood glucose levels at night, and that's now become well known because of those continuous glucose monitors. They can check it. They can get a readout every 5 minutes. You can get a transient hypoglycemia from rebound hypoglycemia, especially drinking excessively sweetened beverage, and your blood glucose spikes, your pancreas overcompensates, releases too much insulin, and your blood glucose level comes down kind of rapidly. High dietary sodium, we talked about that. Basically, it causes a loss of potassium in the urine because the body has to maintain a proper balance of electrolytes. So when excessive sodium comes in, you'll lose more potassium in the urine. They're both monovalent cations. They have a single positive charge on them. And you don't want that because excessive sodium and loss of potassium leads to a dissipation of the neuron sodium electrochemical gradient. So what am I talking about? Every cell has a plasma membrane ion pump that's going to be pumping out sodium and bringing in potassium. And it maintains a slightly negative charge of about negative 65 millivolts in the center of it. And what I'm saying is when you've got excessive sodium, you're going to get sodium leak into that cell, and the cell's not going to be as strongly negatively charged, and you're not going to have as much of a gradient of sodium outside and inside the cell. That gradient is like a battery of energy power for the cell to do other things, like to pump out calcium. So excessive dietary sodium weakens your ability to pump out calcium. It weakens your knockout exchanger, your sodium-calcium exchanger in the plasma membrane. In addition, low dietary potassium, K+, it's a vasodilator. So when you lose that vasodilator and you got excess of sodium, you're vasoconstricting, decreasing blood supply to your tissue. And we talked about needing that for the potassium sodium ATPase. That's the pump. The energy from that is coupled to the knockout exchanger for pumping out calcium across the plasma membrane. Low dietary magnesium. Magnesium is a vasodilator. It also blocks the NMDA receptor. Right in the center of the receptor, there's a magnesium molecule. Here, I'll put some. So imagine this is magnesium molecule. It's sitting right in the center of that glutamate receptor channel. It's also called the NMDA receptor because there's several different receptors for glutamate. And the magnesium blocks it so that no calcium can get through there. That's a very good thing. Magnesium is called the mellow out hormone. M for magnesium, M for mellow out. It calms you down. And to some extent, food and mood affect each other. So a plant-based diet, you're going to have more magnesium, you're going to have less sodium. A low sodium plant-based diet, and that helps to mellow out a person's personality. The next thing is SERCA inhibitors. SERCA stands for SERCA, that's sarcoplasm endoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase inhibitors. And that is the pump that pumps calcium out of the cytoplasm and pumps it into the endoplasmic reticulum of the hippocampal neuron. There's a lot of things that inhibit the SERCA, calcium ATPase. And these include lead, mercury, cadmium, aluminum, red dye number 3, preservatives, BHT, BHA, TBHQ. A lot of stuff does it. Estrogenic chemicals, BPA, atrazine, chemicals in sunscreen, oxybenzone, titanium dioxide nanoparticles, paints, glues, chlorine inhalation, alcohol, MJ. And so what I'm basically saying is something smells bad, it is bad. And there tends to be a lot of these things in processed food. You'll find some of these things in air pollution. So basically, you want to avoid things to the extent you can. I wouldn't eat any processed food. I wouldn't eat anything with these food dyes in it. And so being aware of all these different things helps you. You eat a plant-based diet, you're going to get lots of magnesium, lots of potassium. Have a low-salt diet so you don't get excessive amounts of dietary sodium. And if you do that, you probably won't have a problem with these other diseases, which are all typical from a high-fat diet with a lot of processed food. I recommend avoiding caffeine. I think it's just one more thing that has a negative effect on your brain potentially. Hyperglycemia related to diabetes can also eventually lead to glycation of some of your SERCA enzyme pumps, okay? Now here's some other examples of sources of either monosodium glutamate. By the way, they can tell you there's no MSG in the product. They don't have to put MSG on there unless it's 99% pure MSG, monosodium glutamate. So anytime I see natural flavors, as far as I'm concerned, it's probably MSG till proven otherwise. It certainly could be lots of other things, thousands of other things. But I just wanted you to get a sense of things that either definitely contain MSG or some of these things only maybe contain MSG. Some of them don't always necessarily contain MSG, but just to be aware of it. The manufacturers of MSG know that people don't want it in their food, so they've been able to change it into all kinds of different variants so that they don't have to put the word MSG on the package. And quite often there'll be several different sources of excessive amounts of free glutamate in that same package. And why do they put it on there? Because it's a flavor enhancer. That's the only thing the food companies want from it, is it makes stuff taste really good. It can take a bland tasting processed food and make it taste great, but it's not good for your health. You're being tricked by this, Okay, some of the names it can go under: broth, bouillon, barley malt, malted barley, malt extract, maltodextrin, oligodextrin, caseinate, carrageenan, citric acid, all these different things. Any prefix with the word glutamate. Any type of protein, you got to be careful about it. Hydrolyzed protein, hydrolyzed vegetable protein, protein powder, protein fortified, protein isolate, protein concentrate, also pectin, seasonings, soy sauce, spices, stock, seaweed, textured protein, ultra-pasteurized products, vitamin-enriched, whey protein, yeast extract. Whenever I see, some of the most common ones I've seen is barley malt, malt extract, So just be aware of that. It's relatively ubiquitous in processed foods. That's why I don't eat any processed food. So what do I mean by processed food? Something that comes in a package with a label on it, a nutrient label. There should only be one ingredient in a good food, like just peas, just blueberries, for example, apples, just pears, just one thing, just beans. The more things there are on there, the more likely there's MSG in your food stuff. I, for example, had all these organic cereals that I used to eat years ago that I thought were good. And then when I started more carefully going over the package, I realized I ended up throwing them all out and I stopped eating the cereal because almost every single one had MSG in it, despite being organic and being the healthier organics. Okay, just briefly, some people are concerned also about casein and gluten. There's approximately 20 amino acids in human proteins. And most proteins contain about 5 to 10% glutamate, which is what you'd expect based on about 20 amino acids. However, there's some proteins that are very concentrated in glutamate, in particular casein, the milk protein, and gluten, like the wheat protein. And the significance is when these foods are processed, now the proteins are broken apart and much more of that glutamate is free. So that means the body has less work to do in terms of being able to absorb it. So you're more prone to absorb excessive amounts and have more of it than you'd like get into your blood. Normally the gut lining, the enterocytes, are pretty good at sequestering glutamate, converting it to something else. Some of the processed foods, you run into problems. Instead of just having L-glutamate, you'll have L and D-glutamate. And I don't know how well the body is able at handling the D-glutamates. So these are just some things to be aware of. So the two big things to get out of this lecture: number one, MSG and manufactured free glutamate can have a lot of different names. You got to be careful. Probably the smart move is just don't eat processed food at all, except for rare exceptions when you're at a restaurant. Be especially careful about feeding it to a very young child, like a baby or a very young child, because their blood-brain barrier is not formed as well. Also, be especially careful about feeding it to an elderly person, because they've often got gaps in their blood-brain barrier due to previous trauma, ischemia, stroke, and whatnot. But even in a healthy person, there's areas of the brain that don't have a blood-brain barrier. There's areas that are chemical sensors of the blood, and especially around the third ventricle. Those are called circumventricular, around the ventricle organs that lack a blood-brain barrier. And that includes parts of the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus can be damaged, and some other important areas of the brain. And it provides an access point for something that otherwise would not traverse the blood-brain barrier, like the charge on the physiologic glutamate. So anyways, all the different potential names, and also just an introduction to the concept of excitotoxicity. I can tell you, I think that's one of the key ways that people have brain damage, is they'll be simultaneously exposed to several different things that are ramping up the metabolic demands of the neurons in the hippocampus and other parts of the brain, while they're simultaneously lowering the blood supply due to sodium vasoconstriction, due to dietary fat with rouleau formation, and then they simultaneously can often be exposed to SERCA inhibitors, which are further diminishing their ability to pump out the calcium. So you can see what's happening is, without realizing it, people are screwing over their hippocampal neurons, cranking up the metabolic demands, dropping the blood supply, and then dropping the ability to pump out the calcium. So that poor neuron is just as overwhelmed, fires all these action potentials, can't keep up, and it goes into apoptosis and dies. And then the person gradually becomes progressively stupider. So anyways, I hope that helps.